Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. The business of ranking prime ministers is controversial. Partisan biases and arguments over what criteria to use, longevity, policy achievement, leadership through crises, all these make rankings tough to defend. One of Australia's leading psephologists joins me today to talk about how he has ranked Australia's prime ministers, 1 through to 30. Welcome to Afternoon Light, Malcolm Mackerras.
Good afternoon, Georgina.
It's great to have you here, Malcolm. And you have got a ranking of 30 of Australia's former prime ministers.
Yeah.
Obviously not the current one, because I guess we wait and see how he does. But as I was saying in my introduction, this is quite controversial.
It is.
Full of lots of debates. Others have tried it before. You've been doing this for the last 16 years. Where did you come up with the idea of ranking prime ministers? Why did you think it was important?
I came up with it because I've followed American and Canadian politics as well. So I brought with me a book about ranking American presidents and another one about ranking Canadian prime ministers. And I thought the Canadian prime minister's ranking was very interesting, and I more or less followed that.
I see. And how do they go about ranking their prime ministers?
Well, they do accept longevity as being a help in greatness. They do accept winning elections as being a help in greatness, and I accept that too, which is why I put Menzies first.
Yes, so in your ranking of former prime ministers, so 1 to 30, you've got 4 categories: great, high average, low average, and did not win an election, and almost 8 in each category. And yes, as you say, Robert Menzies is first, followed by John Curtin, Alfred Deakin, Andrew Fisher, Bob Hawke, Billy Hughes, John Howard, Joseph Lyons. I won't read them all out, but people listening to this will, I'm sure, identify that there are some very high-profile, prominent prime ministers who aren't in that top 8. This list, though, it isn't static. I mean, obviously, as prime ministers come and go, you've been adding to your list. But also, some of the prime ministers from very, very far in the past have changed position.
Quite so.
So how do you get to that? Do you change your mind over the years you do this?
Well, there are certain things that I might have given marks for or against in the past that I now reflect upon and think otherwise. In a way, the most controversial ranking I have is between Hughes and Howard. Now, I originally ranked Howard a bit lower than I now do, and that was partly because I was writing originally in the immediate aftermath of his defeat, both as member for Bennelong and as Prime Minister, and I decided I did put him a bit too low, so I raised his rank. The controversial one, however, is why I put Hughes ahead of Howard. And I've kept Hughes 1 rank ahead of Howard. Well, my explanation for that is that I give marks for wartime leadership. Now, I distinguish between Curtin and Hughes in as much as Curtin united the country in the war, in the Second World War. Hughes divided the country. But nevertheless, it was extremely important that Australia win that First World War. It really was. So for that reason, I think people have marked Hughes down too much. So for that reason, I put Hughes among my great prime ministers, which Labor supporters don't like, and Labor supporters don't like me putting Lyons in that list either. But they were both election winners. In the case of Hughes, he was critical in the First World War, and in the case of Lyons, he helped drag the country out of the Depression.
Yes, I think 2 very underrated prime ministers oftentimes. I'm surprised how little focus there is on Billy Hughes as an Australian leader. There's not really any very contemporary biographies of him, and It's very hard to find people to talk to about Billy Hughes. He was a member of most political parties except the Country Party, and I love the quote from him that he had to draw the line somewhere.
Yes, quite so, yeah. Well, the point is, the First World War, his contribution to winning the First World War was of extreme importance, and he got everything right, even including appointing the right generals and so forth. And therefore, I think he has to go quite high. Not as high as Curtin, but he has to go high, and he has to be rated as a great prime minister, has to be. And I think he has to go ahead of Howard because he's a wartime leader, and Howard was a peacetime prime minister.
Well, one might argue that Howard was Prime Minister during times when Australian troops were committed to wars overseas, but not where Australia was directly threatened.
Quite so. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not the same thing.
Sure. Yeah, it's your judgment. Billy Hughes too, like Menzies, played a sort of international statesman role, of course, with the Treaty of Versailles.
That's right.
That would give him, I guess, a few points as well.
And he made the famous remark when Woodrow Wilson tried to put him down. He said famously, "I represent 60,000 Australian dead, Mr. President," drawing attention to the fact that twice as many Australian lives were lost as American lives. Twice as many.
Yeah, and our population much, much smaller.
Well, quite so.
So John Howard comes in at number 7, as you say, behind Billy Hughes, behind Bob Hawke, Andrew Fisher, Alfred Deakin, John Curtin and Robert Menzies. But ahead of Joseph Lyons.
Yes.
What led to you putting John Howard in that number 7 spot? And as you say, originally you had him lower, but on reflection as the time from his defeat in 2007 passed, your views on him softened.
Well, basically, yeah. I think that the historical verdict is more favourable to him than would have been perceived when I did this first article back in the first year Kevin Rudd was Prime Minister. I wrote the first article in August 2008. Well, that was very soon after Howard lost the election. And I think my judgment may have been affected by that, and now I've put him a bit higher.
So John Howard is number 7 due to longevity in office, 11 and a half years.
And winning elections. Yes.
And winning 4 elections, which was a pretty significant feat. Were there any other aspects of his prime ministership that you thought put him into the great category?
I would say the gun reforms in his first year. I would say the introduction of the GST was one. Those are the 2 main things I can think of.
And so when you're determining greatness or lack thereof in a prime minister, longevity of office is obviously important.
Yeah.
Policy achievements come into it.
Well, I think the ability to make tough decisions and still maintain popularity is an important characteristic, which is why I put Hawke quite high.
Yes, and Hawke only 8 years. And, I mean, Curtin only 4 years, of course.
Well, that's the interesting thing.
Cut off because he dies in office.
That's right. Yeah. Curtin's period of Prime Minister was the same as Scott Morrison's. Yeah, they ranked right next to each other in terms of longevity.
But you put Scott Morrison at number 16, so quite a different category.
Well, I put Scott Morrison, however, as the greatest post-Howard Prime Minister.
Yeah,
have you noticed that?
Which is I would have thought.
I've consciously said of the prime ministers since Howard, I decided that Rudd doesn't really need to go any higher.
He's 18.
Gillard should go higher than Rudd,
but only just. She's at 17. Yeah,
I put Morrison ahead of Turnbull and Abbott.
Yeah. He's number 16.
So why have I given preferential treatment to Morrison? That should be the question you're asking, isn't it?
It is.
Why have I called him in one category and the others in a lower category?
You've put Morrison in the high average category. So led by Chifley, then Stanley Bruce, Paul Keating, Malcolm Fraser, Gough Whitlam, Edmund Barton, Harold Holt, and then finally Scott Morrison. So I mean, there's some very significant leaders. I mean, Chifley,
I think
Keating.
the AUKUS agreement was a very important agreement.
Yeah.
Now, lots of people don't agree with me, and lots of people would say in 30 years' time, people will say that AUKUS was a dud. Well, I don't happen to think so. So I put AUKUS as a significant achievement, as well as handling the pandemic pretty well and winning one election.
Yes, and winning against the odds, of course. He was certainly expected to lose in 2019, but amazingly, he said himself it was a miracle. And of course, it's the Robert Menzies Institute you're here visiting. So Robert Menzies comes in at number 1, which, based on longevity of office, is a clear winner there. 18 years in total, but 16 years in office the second time around. So, incredible achievement. But were there other aspects of Menzies' leadership that put him number 1? Because I know when you look at, say, Paul Strangio's rankings, he does quite a lot of surveys of academics at Monash and Canberra and all the different rankings that were done. Barry Jones has done his ranking. I mean, John Curtin or Ben Chifley, they often come top of those rankings, not Menzies. And often Menzies is sort of 4 or 5 on the list.
Well, in the ranking of the top 10 done by the academics, an academic survey, that is around about 300 academics fill in forms and that sort of thing. He puts Curtin first, Hawke second, Deakin third, Chifley fourth, and Menzies fifth. Yeah, I think that's rather remarkable because it shows how biased in favour of Labor Australian academics are, or at least were in that survey. Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable that you put Menzies fifth. It is remarkable that you'd put him below Chifley, isn't it? I
would have thought so. Yeah.
Well, I think that's quite extraordinary. Chifley is 1 rung ahead of Menzies, who's 1 rung ahead of Keating. Now, to put Menzies just 1 rung ahead of Keating is really pretty absurd.
Yes, Keating wins only 1 election.
He won 1 election, went out in a very decisive defeat that was rather humiliating, with no particular achievements that I can think of. Well, there was an agreement with Indonesia, a treaty, but it didn't last anyway, so I find it quite extraordinary that his survey has Menzies at 5, Keating at 6 and Whitlam at 7. I think that's the most extraordinary ranking.
Yes, it's sort of a ranking based on the kind of mythologising around those prime ministers rather than a scrutiny of their longevity in office, policy achievements. So. I mean, Curtin, obviously, wartime prime minister, but so was Robert Menzies. I mean, Menzies was the prime minister who announced that Australia was at war on the 5th of September, I think it was, 1939. Yeah. Menzies is prime minister all through that period of 1940 into 1941, while Australia is really having to get prepared for the war that will come to its shores.
Well, I don't know that Menzies deserves a great deal of credit for that particular point.
Well, he put together the Empire Air Service scheme, which led to tens of thousands of pilots being trained in Australia. He established the munitions factories, really development of a lot of the manufacturing capability that would be diverted to supporting the war effort.
But his statement of going to war didn't earn him a great deal of credit at the time, did it?
Well,
he said because the United Kingdom is at war, Australia is automatically at war. That wasn't a very wise way of describing it, was it?
Well, I would say, Malcolm, at that time, Australia was part of the British Empire. That is how Australia thought of itself. So whether, in 2024 eyes, we look at that and go, oh, that's, a little bit
But the point is, he wasn't ahead of his time in that way, was he?
He was of his era, of his time. Yeah. I don't think
But he wasn't ahead of his time, was he?
Well, would you...
Whereas I think with the Australia-Japan Treaty, for example, in 1957, Menzies was ahead of his time. And I think purchasing the F-111 aircraft, Menzies was ahead of his time, took a risk, which turned out to be a correct decision.
Are there any...
So I'm not criticising... Well, I still put Menzies first, so...
Yeah. So what were some of the other achievements of Robert Menzies? I mean, the F-111 aircraft, the commerce agreement with Japan. Was it things like the ANZUS with the United States, that home ownership, the higher education reforms?
Well, he certainly saved the universities in 1957 and so through the Murray report that he adopted in total. And he also developed Canberra, for what that's worth.
Yes. Well, you're a resident there. You benefit from it.
Well, I live there, so Canberra was given a great kick-along by Menzies, no doubt about it.
Yes, I'm always amused by the story of why he was incentivised to kick it along, as you say. It was his daughter, Heather, had her first baby and was pushing a pram around the streets of Canberra and there were no footpaths and it was all sort of dirt roads. And she said, this is intolerable. This is hardly... something, a national capital we can be proud of, and away he went.
That's right. Yeah. Well, he, without doubt, he gave Canberra the kick along it needed at the correct time.
Yeah. And Malcolm, you, even as a child, were a keen watcher of politics and Menzies politics. You even had an interaction with him, didn't you, where you gave him a bit of political advice?
I gave him some political advice in 1953, which made the papers. And I record this on my blog for what it's worth in an essay called Myself When Young. The point is, however, the essay is written by somebody else. There's no use me writing about myself. But somebody else thought this was quite an amusing incident.
And so you suggested to Robert Menzies at this public meeting at the 53 half Senate election that he should pass all the necessary legislation before his majority elapsed.
Yeah, fine.
And what did Menzies say back to you in reply?
He said, "You remind me of myself at your age." And he said, "Thank you for your advice, but there's a coronation on and I'm going to go to that." Anyway, he kept the Senate majority anyway. He kept the Senate majority. That's the important thing. So he didn't need my advice because he won the majority that I expected he would lose.
Maybe that's why he didn't pass all that legislation before he knew.
Well, he didn't need to. There was no need to. Because, as I say, I was predicting wrongly that he would lose the Senate majority in the half Senate election, but he kept that majority, so he didn't need my advice anymore.
Malcolm, you've said that wartime leadership is important, not definitive, but it certainly puts John Curtin in number 2 spot, even with only 4 years in office. What about other crises like the Great Depression, economic crises or natural disasters, overcoming a sort of a national emergency? Do they elevate a Prime Minister?
Well, I suppose so. Never let a good crisis go to waste is one of the things that Prime Ministers say to themselves.
Absolutely.
But I'm not entirely sure what examples you have in mind.
Well, I look at Joseph Lyons. He was the Depression era.
I put him
Prime
in the
Minister.
great category.
Yeah. So
that's why I put him in the great category.
But
Labor people don't agree with that, of course, needless to say. I mean, Labor people would say that's an incredible decision to put him in the great category and not put Chifley. Well, that's what I think. I mean, I think Chifley is overrated by Labor people.
Well, Paul Keating called him a plodder.
Yes.
And said that Curtin was just a trier.
Yes, well, I would say Keating was right on Chifley, but not right on Curtin.
Yeah. But that potentially when Keating was calling Curtin a trier, that was more a dig at Bob Hawke, who revered Curtin.
Yes, it was. Yes.
John Hurst, the historian, now passed, he said that there were no great Australian Prime Ministers. What do you say to that?
Well, if you assert that, you assert that. But, I mean, I have to find some. So I have found them.
So your rankings really are just saying these are the Prime Ministers, the 30 you're looking at, and I'm going to rank them between great, high average, low average to did not win an election.
That's right. And I'm following the Canadian book that I have actually brought with me that I could show you.
Yeah.
And I'm following the Canadian thing mainly because I think Canada and Australia are rather good countries to compare and contrast, aren't they?
Yes.
They have a number of things in common.
Yeah.
But they also have a number of things that are very different. I mean, for example, Canada's a cold country and Australia's a hot country. But they have a lot of things in common. They are the most populous and second most populous constitutional monarchies after the United Kingdom itself. So they are very comparable with each other. I think it's quite amusing that Canada has never debated the question of the monarchy. Australia has. But Australia came to the same decision as Canada when Canada didn't bother to even debate it. Australia did debate it and came to the same conclusion, which was to keep the constitutional monarchy, which means keeping the king or queen on the coins.
Yes, it's interesting that with the United States, yes, there's the Queen. You've got the Queen and the King on your $2 coins here. Fantastic. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, we are still a constitutional monarchy.
Yes, that's right.
We obviously just had the visit of the King and Queen last week. But when people talk about US presidents, I mean, they really do revere them in the United States. And they talk about, Ronald Reagan was a great president, Roosevelt, a great president. Yeah. But commentators in Australia, they often think of our prime ministers as just, a little bit pedestrian and hardly inspiring. And, of course, Donald Horne in The Lucky Country says we're a lucky country blessed with mediocre leaders or some such. So what do you say to that, Malcolm?
Well, Australia is not a country of the size of the United States. I mean, the United States is the major success country in the world, isn't it? And it has an importance that Australia doesn't have. So Australia, in that respect, is actually quite like Canada. Smaller in population, but being an island of its own, it's roughly comparable. And I don't think we should put down our prime ministers. And as for the President of the United States, well, there's a certain amount of disagreement, but there's also a certain amount of agreement. I mean, I think there's agreement that Lincoln comes in first, Franklin Roosevelt second, George Washington third. Some people would say Washington should go first. And then there's a near great. The greatest argument about who the failures should be. Well, I mean, for example,
Jimmy Carter usually comes last, doesn't he?
I have Donald Trump as the 5th worst president, but if he wins this forthcoming election, I will revise that ranking.
Yeah.
I will have to say, well, the American people didn't agree with my ranking, but I have him at the moment as the 5th worst president,
but
which
course,
I think is appropriate.
Yeah.
But if he loses the election, that will stay. If he wins the election, I will simply have to revise that opinion.
Yes, well, indeed. Well, he'll have won another election. Who is your worst US president then? Is it Jimmy Carter?
My worst US president is James Buchanan,
Oh.
the one just before Lincoln. In other words, the one whose inaction caused the Civil War to occur. My second worst is Andrew Johnson, the immediate post-Lincoln. In other words, my greatest is Lincoln, and my two worst are the ones just before and the one just after. And the next one is Franklin Pierce. Now, he was the one before Buchanan, so he gets the blame along with Buchanan. And the next one is Warren Harding. Now, Warren Harding, I'm putting him low purely because if you read that book about American great, the same exercise, almost all the historians put him bottom.
I guess with these rankings, Malcolm, there is massive recency bias, isn't there?
Yes,
I mean,
there is.
You know, the historians writing today or political scientists writing today, they know the prime ministers or presidents in the case of the US that they've grown up with and they've lived through. Whereas when we're talking about Alfred Deakin, we're talking about Billy Hughes, prime ministers like Edmund Barton, Joseph Cook, most people haven't even heard of these. So just the ability to scrutinise their achievements, their contribution, their impact, aside from just sort of numerical things like longevity in office, it starts to become quite a challenge, doesn't it?
Well, it does. Well, I deliberately put these prime ministers of long ago high. That's a deliberate thing because they are out of mind and because other people don't think about them, I deliberately promote them. Now, Fisher's an example of that. I mean, in this Labor-biased survey that we were talking about earlier on, what's interesting is that all these Labor academics don't include Fisher. Now, I think that's most extraordinary. I mean, they include recent, not very successful Labor prime ministers like Chifley, like Keating, like Whitlam, but not Fisher. Yet Fisher was a very successful prime minister.
Yes, he was the first prime minister to establish a Labor majority government in 1910, and New Zealand had to wait until 1935 and Britain until 1945 for a majority Labor government.
That's right.
And then he obviously contributes to the establishment of Canberra. Obviously, Menzies continues that. The Trans-Australia Railway, the Royal Australian Navy, Social Security payments, the Commonwealth Bank, and he left office on his own terms.
Quite so. Well, therefore, that's why I put him quite high up. And I find it most extraordinary that these Labor academics would include these relatively three failed prime ministers. I mean, you'd have to say, wouldn't you, that Chifley, Whitlam and Keating were failed prime ministers, weren't they?
Well,
Wouldn't you say, honestly, Chifley was a failed prime minister? He went out badly and kept the Labor Party out for a very, very, very long time. He nationalised the banks, which was a completely stupid thing to do. You'd have to say Keating was a failure, wouldn't you? He benefited from Hawke.
Yeah.
That's why he became Prime Minister. You'd have to say Whitlam. Well, Whitlam was there for a shorter period than Julia Gillard, actually.
Whitlam is a curiosity to me. He's Prime Minister for, I think it's 1,073 days or something. I'm going to not get the particular days right, but it's just a touch over 1,000 days, right? Yeah. He does win 2 elections.
He wins 2 elections, yeah.
So that's a plus. And then he drives through such an ambitious reform agenda that it goes well beyond what the Australian public really, really sort of are accepting of. And they, I mean, okay, he's dismissed, yes, but then, I mean, Malcolm Fraser is elected in a landslide at the end of 1975. So that is a real repudiation of the Whitlam agenda. And it's interesting because I guess he is the, the dragon slayer ending 22 years of Liberal coalition rule.
Yeah.
He's lionised. He's held up as a hero, but the actual policy achievements and the popularity of this leader are very much brought into question.
And in any event, the second election win came after 18 months. Now, when you can organise an early election and blame it on your opponents, you have an advantage. I mean, Mr Albanese has to wait a full 3 years to test this question. He was able to engineer an election after 18 months and blame it on the opponents. So I would say that his second election win wasn't quite as meritorious as might otherwise appear to be the case. And he has failed in quite a lot of long-term ways. Well, I mean, for example, take the dismissal. It seems to me quite obvious that all the Whitlam apologists over the dismissal have been proved wrong, haven't they? Well, I would say they've been proved wrong. All the conspiracy theories of people like Jenny Hocking and those sort of people, they've all been proved wrong by history, I would say.
Yes, yeah.
I can't imagine you would disagree.
No, well, the sort of idea that the Queen was there meddling in the background.
Well, quite. And the whole idea of becoming a republic essentially began with Whitlam. Well, it's been a failure, really. I mean, it's as simple as that.
Yeah.
The people have decided to keep the monarchy permanently.
Yes.
And the whole idea of the inevitability of the republic, well, I always thought it was absurd, but it's now obviously absurd. I mean, when Anthony Albanese says on his election that he'll go for the Voice as his first priority and then for the Republic, and then decides after the Voice to follow the Menzies example, which is when you have a disastrous referendum, you make a permanent resolution. There will be no more referendums while I'm Prime Minister. That's what Menzies did in 1951. He decided on that, and he kept that promise to himself.
And I think we all draw a huge sigh of relief because they are quite disruptive. I mean, the Voice last year, it created fissures within Australia that I don't think we quite realised were there, and I don't think they're solved yet.
But I think Albanese has learnt the lesson. Don't you?
Well, I'd say so. His Republic Minister is now no more.
Quite true. Yes.
Yeah. So tell me about, talking about Prime Ministers of very, very long ago, Alfred Deakin. So Deakin is at number 3.
Yeah.
He's Prime Minister between 1903 and 4, 1905 and 8, and 1909 and 10.
Yeah.
But if winning elections is such an important part of your calculations, how did Deakin end up in this position without ever winning majority government at an election?
Well, I agree that that's a paradox, but I am deferring to other people in this. I mean, Menzies himself said that Deakin was the greatest Prime Minister, by the way. I recall distinctly hearing him at a public meeting saying he thought Deakin was the greatest Prime Minister because he was the great constructor, was the way he put it. And he constructed all these things that they call the Deakinite settlement. Now, it's true that after, 80 odd years or something, these ideas have passed into the past. And nevertheless, he was the great constructor, the arbitration system, and all those other characteristics of the Deakinite settlement. So I think he has to go in as a very high rank.
And do you think too that these early Prime Ministers, for them, governing was a bit more of a challenge? I mean, they didn't
I do think so, yeah.
The telecommunication system we have, so it was much slower to communicate, much slower to get places. Flying was difficult, trains were really slow.
I do think that, yeah.
There weren't the opinion polls and tracking and the psephologists like you to help them.
Yeah.
So do you give them a bit of a handicap for
Yes, I do. I give them marks
experienced?
which are effectively kind of handicap equivalent, yeah.
Yeah. And how difficult have you found it, Malcolm, to deal with the sort of recent glut of Prime Ministers, the revolving door that we've had, I guess, since 2007? Does it make calculating and ranking Prime Ministers harder when you have so many to slot in?
Not really, no. I mean, I think my ranking is correct. I think Morrison has the greatest claim to have achieved things. Rudd, I think, was a failure. I think you are a failure when your party dumps you and won't let you contest another election. Abbott was clearly a failure. I mean, when you have this so-called landslide victory and then you lose the office 2 years later because your party won't trust you to take you to another election, and that happened to both Rudd and Abbott. Well, what are Abbott's achievements, for example? As far as I can tell, his only achievement was that he stopped the boats. Well, I can't think of any other achievement of Abbott. Can you?
Pretty big achievement. And free trade agreements. He had a healthy agenda of free trade agreements.
Well, that's true.
Yeah. But tell me, Malcolm, what about the other Malcolm? Malcolm Fraser. There were a couple of Malcolms as Prime Ministers. Malcolm Fraser. So you put him above Gough Whitlam, which I'm sure makes you pretty unpopular with Whitlam's side of politics. And, of course, Malcolm Fraser ending Gough Whitlam's prime ministership through the dismissal. What led to his ranking of 12, so above Whitlam but below Keating?
Well, I would say one achievement of Fraser was that he was able to carry 3 constitutional reforms at referendums, at the referendum in 1977. Well, no other Prime Minister has achieved more than one change to the Constitution. He actually achieved 3, which I think was quite significant, even if, well, I mean, the Senate casual vacancies things are a little bit controversial, I know, and I suppose the 3 things were not very controversial, but he did succeed in that, and he governed for quite a long time, and he had 2 significant victories and a third that wasn't a good victory at all, but he served a longer period, and I would say he deserves 1 rank higher than Whitlam.
He is, I think,
that's my opinion.
He is a somewhat overlooked Prime Minister, probably a bit like Joseph Lyons. He latterly parts company with his political party, the Liberal Party. He renounces his lifetime membership. Yeah. And, of course, on policy matters, particularly immigration, he parts company with the Liberal Party of the Howard era and latterly. So he doesn't have supporters on his own side of politics. Well, I think that's
one of his problems, actually.
And then,
that's his problem.
His opponent,
he's denigrated by both sides.
Yeah, and his opponents don't like him because of his role in the dismissal.
So. He is denigrated by both sides unfairly in both cases, and therefore I think he deserves a better opinion than other people would say.
It's interesting, Malcolm, how post-political life can taint or help the Prime Minister's legacy.
Yeah.
Do you factor that into your ranking?
Not really, no. But I would say the one who emerges very favourably out of that is Julia Gillard.
Yeah.
And to a lesser extent, John Howard. The other 3 don't benefit from that.
But you changed this list after some time, elevating John Howard. Yeah. I mean, was it partly his sort of behaviour post-Prime Ministership that made you give him a little bit,
Well, I suppose it's part of that, perhaps.
Yeah.
Part of it.
Yeah.
It's just that as time goes by, you often revise your opinion about things.
Do you think that hung parliaments and minority government should count as election wins?
Yes.
You've got Malcolm Turnbull in at 19, below Kevin Rudd but above Tony Abbott. He does win, but it's pretty line ball. And, of course, Julia Gillard wins but
well, she did win an election.
She did win an election. But not an outright majority.
No, it was not a very good win, but she did win an election and Turnbull did win an election.
Yeah. So you take it as whoever is, if you form government, even if it's not majority seats in the lower house,
quite so.
That's a win.
You would say that Gillard won an election and you'd say that Turnbull won an election, just as you would say that Jeremy Rockcliffe recently won an election. You may have noticed that Jeremy Rockcliffe recently won an election.
Yes.
He claimed to win.
Yeah.
Well, he did win. But he's in a very poor minority position.
Yeah.
But he still won an election.
Indeed. So a win is a win.
Well, a win is a win, yes. A win is a win.
Do you think that for modern-day Prime Ministers it's just going to be too hard to enter the top 8, your great category? I mean,
I do actually think that.
You've got the only Prime Minister of the 2000s in your list of greats is John Howard. And then the next one is Bob Hawke. And after that, they are literally, from another era.
That's right.
The next one is, of course, Menzies ending in 66, and then Curtin. These are not recent prime ministers. So
well, I agree. I mean, the recent prime ministers, I think the tide has turned. It's become more difficult to be prime minister, actually. It's partly because of all these minor parties getting so many votes, which is part of the reason why the no vote at referendums keeps on increasing. I mean, you may have noticed that the no voting at referendums has definitely been on the increase, and I think that's partly related to the increase in minor party voting.
It's scepticism of government and
scepticism
the system.
Of government has the effect of producing these probabilities of hung parliaments when it was virtually unknown when I was a boy. Yeah, I do think that. Yeah.
But it's interesting, Julia Gillard claims that she was able to pass a significant amount of legislation despite the fact she was in minority government. So that ability to work through with the independents, work legislation through with the independents, I mean, that's presumably a testament to political, nous and
well, quite so. Well, that's why I put her
persuasion.
Higher than Rudd. That's why I put her higher than Abbott or Turnbull.
But if you say governing these days is harder, then shouldn't you get extra points for being able to achieve things despite the fact you're governing in, the 2020s?
Well, you're talking about Julia Gillard, aren't you?
I was thinking even of Scott Morrison. I mean, you've put him in the high average, number 16, but AUKUS, I mean, he had the pandemic. That would have been an incredibly difficult time to govern.
Well, I don't think he deserves a higher rank. I think I've done him justice by putting him in that higher category. Yeah. Even if only just into it.
Yeah. And then, of course...
And I really do think both Turnbull and Abbott were failures. I think you'd have to say they were failures in one form or another.
And what about Paul Keating? I mean, he gets number 11, which is still a decent rank in the high average category. He's only Prime Minister for 5 years, wins just one election, obviously turfs out Bob Hawke.
He won office courtesy of Bob Hawke.
But he drove a significant set of policy reforms with Bob Hawke, of course, mainly with Bob Hawke as Prime Minister. So Paul Keating's strongest legacy is as Treasurer of Australia. But
quite so. Well, mine is as Prime Minister.
As Prime Minister, yeah.
In fact, I'd say Keating and Costello were both very good treasurers. The difference is that Keating became Prime Minister and Costello didn't. That's the only difference, really, as far as I can tell.
Do you think that these rankings in the end are very helpful? I mean, do they have a utility, or is it just it's a nice little exercise to do and, of course, a reminder of our history?
Well, I think the latter, really. I suppose you'd have to say that lots and lots of things that academics do are not really much use to anybody, including me.
It's good for debates, though.
Yeah, good for debates, yeah. Good for debate. Good for a discussion. Good for a parlour game, as they say.
Indeed. I'm sad that poor George Reid, he gets in the bottom category at 25, didn't win an election. But in terms of a policy contribution, he was a leading free trader and an important player in the story of the development of Australian liberalism.
Yeah.
But
his ideas became more or less discredited for about 60 years, didn't they?
He had his time.
He's come back into his own a bit more recently, but
True.
For about 60 years, his ideas were generally somewhat discredited.
Yeah. And he just pips Chris Watson, of course, who's at 26. And he was the first Labor Prime Minister, I think, of a national government. I think there had been one of a state government before, but he was the first Labor Prime Minister in the world.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
But surely he got a few points for that. That's quite an achievement.
Well, I've just decided to be arithmetical about that and simply rank them in the number of days in office, and that is the number of days in office. McMahon is top of that, purely because he was the largest number of days in office. And for what it's worth, there's a book about the Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison government just out that has a table that I put in which simply shows the number of days in office. And I've ranked those in terms of that.
Now,
and as I say, it's from this list that I know that Morrison and Curtin were there for exactly the same number of days.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah,
amazing coincidence. Now, Malcolm, We have an election next year. You're a psephologist, so
Yeah.
you, of course, study these things in
Yeah.
great detail. Do you think you'll be in a position to add another Prime Minister to the rankings list, or do you think we'll continue with the Albanese government and you'll have to wait another term?
I think there are 2 chances in 3 that Albanese will win the election in one form or other.
Whether minority or majority?
I would say it's very probable he'll lead a minority government and have a win, a bit like Julia Gillard's, probably giving him a period of time in office roughly equivalent to hers. Well, a little bit longer, actually, in total.
So based on that, you could be adding another Prime Minister to your
I could be,
ranking
yes,
list
I could
in
be.
the 2028 election.
I do actually think Dutton will be Prime Minister someday, but I don't think he'll win the next election.
Well, you heard it here first. Malcolm Mackerras'
well, that's all right.
predictions. And thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light.
Thank you.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.